Colin, so cappuccino.
Yeah, cappuccino. Uh, will I start where why I'm annoyed and frustrated by everything?
Yeah,
And
why'd you want to talk about it?
okay, so I was walking through one of our shops the other day, and I could hear this conversation in the background. And the barista just put a coffee made of milk and espresso in front of the person, and the person just looked at me like, "That's not a cappuccino." And I mean, I worked bar recently a lot during COVID-19, just because whatever we didn't have enough people to fill shifts. But before that, it's been a long time since I've worked on bar. But it gave me this flashback to this awful conversation of like, that's not a cappuccino, and you're just like, ugh. And then
Right.
I went to one of the other shops, and I got there, and as I was walking in, a customer said, "Oh, can I get?" And you might have various different opinions on how we do this, but so I said, "Can I get a latte, a flat white, a cappuccino?" And the guy's like, "Oh, we just do like one size milk drink. It's going to be delicious. You like it." And they were just like, "But I want a latte and a flat white and a cap." And I was like, "Oh," and I just this conversation comes up all the time. And if there was one thing I could undo in all of what we do, it would just be the definition and understanding of what certain milk drinks are.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm coming from it from the exact. So, thanks for tuning in, folks. This is Colin Harmon, obviously from Dublin, from 3FE in Dublin, Ireland. I'm Nick Cho from Wrecking Ball Coffee Roasters here in San Francisco. I'm coming at it from the exact opposite perspective, actually, which is going to be fun. We didn't really talk about this ahead of time, so we kind of
Nothing.
on Twitter we just both knew that we wanted to talk about cappuccino, but we didn't know sort of the position that each other had.
And we
Because
hadn't talked in a while as well, so
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
good.
yeah. So it's hard for us to sort of not just visit with each other. But let's stay on topic. So for me, the thing about cappuccino that I've been thinking about a lot is just about how, and I guess in a way, like I can say this as sort of like my first counterpoint to you. Like these words mean something to people, to some people. And
Mhm.
ultimately, at the end of the day, like any word is only as good as there's a certain agreed upon like definition.
Hmm.
In coffee, like we argue about vocabulary a lot. And there was a time, for instance, when people didn't, there was a certain kind of person who would object to the use of the word varietal to talk about the variety of coffee subspecies of Arabica coffee. I've never really liked quibbling about words very much because I feel like ultimately it becomes sort of very quickly it becomes weaponized in terms of making people
Hmm.
feel stupid, you
Yeah.
know, and that I recognize that these things can be inconvenient, but interesting. So I guess I wasn't really aware or I hadn't been paying attention, and I think we can forgive each other for that. Like the idea that I didn't. So you guys don't have uh, like cappuccino, latte, like those types of drinks on your menu.
Well, like I think, well, it's this is it's it comes to a place of frustration. I have no issue with people having a definition of what they think a cappuccino is,
Hmm.
and maybe somewhere in my head, and I've never really written it down, I might have a definition of what I think it is, and maybe what a latte is and what a flat white is, and but I suppose the issue is that um, no, if you put 10 coffee professionals in a room that we all respected, we wouldn't all agree on those things.
Hmm.
And I think as well, the idea that somewhere in a town in Italy in the 40s or 30s or whatever, somebody designed something and it was official and specific at that point and it has deviated from there, that's not really true either. And I suppose it's about, I find it really frustrating because as coffee professionals or as hospitality professionals, you want to satisfy people and make them feel welcome when they come to your place. And when they have an idea of what something is and you can't deliver that to their expectations, that to me is really frustrating because I wish that if somebody asked for a cappuccino, I could be assured that I knew exactly what they were talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit, you and I, and take our wayback machine as we can between you and me, and uh, and think about just like as I said on Twitter, like going back 20 years or so to when so third wave was just like people were starting to think in this way, whatever. And we won't get into a whole third wave discussion, but specifically as it pertains to cappuccino. So I can tell you what was happening in the U.S. and I'm interested to hear sort of like you started a little bit later than I did, but in terms of your observations of what was happening around that time, where you are in
Hmm.
Ireland, like for us here, Starbucks was coffee, was redefining what everyone understood about coffee. And this, like, the short, tall, grande venti sort of like nomenclature of sizes also was a thing that Starbucks introduced, and has been like a big deal, right? Like, it's been hard to kind of shake that kind of framing of things. But so a cappuccino for Starbucks was, their 16-ounce cup, which is like this, like
Hmm.
this much fluffy, kind of bubbly milk foam, and then liquid milk, and then the espresso was poured at the beginning. And you could get, yeah, 12, 16. Later, they introduced 20-ounce, I think, in the
Wow.
early 2000s, I think. But point is that when some of us were coming up in that sort of third wave sector, we were like, no, 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 a cappuccino's like this, like not like this, you know. A cappuccino is like, and the barista competitions, I think, is a huge part of this story about cappuccino specifically, and in a bunch of different ways. But this sort of idea of like a classic cappuccino or a traditional cappuccino started taking shape, and informed in a lot of ways by, as the barista competitions emerged, this more Italian, sort of classic, traditional Italian version of it. And
Hmm.
whether it is on the world stage, whether it's Australians or any kind of European talking about it, whether it's a pushback against the Americanization of things, including coffee, as well as like in the States, that the conversation around these things, I think it necessarily had to go through a sort of an Italian sort of like kind of reimagining or sort of like recontextualizing phase. But a lot of that was the influence of David Schomer. So for those who
Yeah.
don't know, like David Schomer, Espresso Vivace Seattle, for a lot of people who are in specialty coffee, like David Schomer is in many ways like, I don't know what analogy to use, but like, was there to help. People talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, he's definitely one of the shoulders out there
Mm.
who was really promoting a certain profile in espresso, and as well as like really trying to be dogmatic at his espresso cart and cafes in Seattle about like what a cappuccino is, what it's not. And like for him, it was really about that kind of size.
And did you find then that at the time when this is happening, so this is probably around like the mid 2000s, I'd imagine, is it? Or
Early 2000s.
yeah, yeah. Did that what you were serving in your shops, is that the same as what you would define as a competition cappuccino? And is it also the same as what you would get in a cafe jumped off a plane in Milan or Rome or Bergamo or somewhere like that?
Right. So for my shop, so we opened in 2002, Murky Coffee in Washington D.C. We had cappuccino and we had classic cappuccino. So classic
Uh,
cappuccino was, again, we served it in like a 5 or 6 ounce cup like this.
and
And
it's a single shot
no, it was still
espresso?
double. It was still double for us. It was still
Really?
double.
Okay.
And but then we had like a regular cappuccino, which was more like a Starbucks, like our version in terms of sizing, but still like our take in terms of quality, and like the milk foam and such was a thing. So
And no
we kind of
chocolate.
had both. No, we didn't have chocolate. We didn't. I chose not to, but it's a thing that you saw from time to time, right? Like chocolate powder or cinnamon was sort of a standard thing in a lot of
Mm.
places. But yeah, it was really interesting just to see like that in of itself was sort of like, in many ways, like a big pushback. It was subversive, right? Like, Starbucks is doing this thing. We wanted to we wanted to not alienate that kind of customer, and ultimately we wanted to sort of embrace them and give them like a stepping stone, or a step on a ladder to where we wanted them to go. But at the time in the early 2000s, like, we didn't have the privilege to be so dogmatic. If we did that, like, people wouldn't understand. There's an evolution
Yeah.
to these things, I think. And yeah, so around that time, I mean, what's your understanding of that sort of like contrast from being in Ireland?
So we opened our shop in 2009. So it's probably, 5 to 6 years later. And the specialty coffee scene, I suppose, was more pronounced in the US, Australia, and parts of the UK. And I think we came from a place, well, the three of us came from a place, I think, of meager privilege in the sense that, like, we could do whatever we wanted. We didn't have any debt. We didn't have any, huge needs to drive sales or anything, just because it was basically me on the counter and another person to help me out every now and again. And I was willing to take a year or so just to like get the idea of good coffee across before we grew anything. So it was just do something that's really nice and gets people interested, and then we can worry about growing it later. So no big rent. For context, we had a counter in a nightclub,
Right.
and we didn't really pay any rent. Okay,
Right.
so it's fine. So what we were trying to do, I suppose, at that time, I was fresh out of barista competitions, and the idea of that small drink was just like, for most people, was just what, I've never seen a coffee drink that small, and that was almost a sales pitch to us. It was like, because people were used to the 12, 16 ounce, and Starbucks is a thing, but the small drink was quite a thing. Now, but what also happened at the same time was that in the UK, um, the flat white had become a thing.
Mm.
And the flat white was, I suppose, amongst all these small independent cool cafes, of which there was probably only a handful in a city of 12 million people in London. But it was almost like a secret code. It wasn't even about a recipe as such. It was like a secret code. If you have you got a flat white, and people go, yes, we do have the flat white. And then the recipe as such didn't really matter. It was more the fact that, oh, we're in the gang. Like we both know what we're talking about here. Because most people that worked in a coffee shop, or most people that bought coffee in London, would be like, what's a flat white?
Well, so the
So
people who are ordering it, sorry to interrupt, the people who are ordering it, you're saying that you don't think that they actually even knew what they were asking for. It's just they heard that was a thing to ask for.
yeah, and it became a code that, like, it's I don't know. In Dublin for a long time recently, it was old fashioned. Now that might be ridiculous to you. I know San Francisco, there's a lot of great cocktail bars, but today it's quite prominent. But like, for, let's say, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, if you went into a bar and you said, "Can I get an old fashioned?" They'd be like, "What's that?"
Hmm.
And then you know that you don't want to order a cocktail there.
Got it.
But if they can make one, if they just look you dead in the eye and go, "Yeah," then you go, "Oh, this place is going to be good." And I suppose that's what the flat white was as well.
Uh
And I think
huh.
when I talk to people about what their okay, gun to your head, purest definition of what a cappuccino is, or purest definition of what a flat white is, they will often give me things that are comparable. Like for instance, you just said that your traditional cappuccino was a double shot in that 5.5, 6 ounce cup.
Right.
I could find you 50 people in the next 3 minutes that will be adamant that that's what a pure, flat white is.
Sure.
That was invented by, yeah. So for us, because we were trying to get this idea across of what a competition cappuccino was, because that was very important to me at the time, because it won a competition.
Yeah.
um, and also the flat white thing starting, and all these things drift across into Ireland after they happen in the UK. It was just, it got to the point where it's like, oh, it's too confusing to try and define or separate these two things. So we just start giving them the same size cup,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, what's on
which
your menu
it did.
now? Like, what does your menu look like in terms of, if you mentioned like someone's going to ask for a cappuccino and a flat white, but do you just have like milk and coffee on your menu? Is that how you're doing it now?
Yeah, we have a menu that says, it was by complete accident. Somebody pointed out to me afterwards, but the menu says cappuccino, americano, filter, and espresso.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And when you look at the first letter of each of those words, it spells cafe,
That
which is
wasn't
like the
intentional.
cheesiest thing ever.
That
It's
was
like,
not
yeah,
intentional.
no, 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 absolutely accidental. But like, and for a long time, we didn't. The only menu we had was the types of coffee we were serving,
Mm-hmm.
which is equally confusing. And a hand on heart, like, I think that we execute how we sell drinks to people really badly, and I wish I could do it better, and that's, I think, why it's so frustrating for us. So when I walk into a coffee shop and there's a customer saying that's not a cappuccino, I just feel like an absolute failure, because
Right.
we're not communicating that very well, and I mean we as a business, but also we as a community. And I wonder, like, do people that sell lasagna or margaritas or whatever, do they have the same issue with definitions and how things are done.
I mean, it happens with other things. I mean, I've had like Trish is a great cook, my wife Trish, and she knows a lot about food. And there's been times where we'll go out to eat and she'll order something and she'll be, "This is not a carbonara," or "This is
Mm.
not," like pizza margarita is a thing in the U.S. that you can find like varying sort of interpretations of. Um, some that are a little bit closer to the DOC sort of Italian, pizza Italiano type sort of like profile. Some that are, just abominations. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess like there's a couple sort of subtopics of this that maybe are worth kind of getting into, and one of them is that idea of like, do these words mean anything? Uh, the idea of the context of like a cafe versus like in the rest of the world, and for that matter in the customer's sort of personal experience, and the idea that that's a diverse group of people. There's that sort of angle. There's also the idea of like the evolution even within people like you and me in that sort of third wave cafe coffee, specialty coffee kind of realm, that even for us I feel like the standards have shifted a lot, for a
Hmm.
number of different reasons. Competition has a part of that story. Trends in roasting and just like roasting lighter and lighter has a part of that story. And sort of the what some have I've heard called, which you don't really hear people talk about, but more second wavers. Sometimes we'll refer to the barista movement as this sort of revolution of sort of like the rise of the proletariat kind of thing when it comes to how they're talking about coffee. And and ultimately, like, let's end up with like, what if there is such a thing as a cappuccino, like what's your sort of favorite version and what's mine.
Yeah.
So starting with the first thing, so like I said, I find it interesting. I wasn't sure if your cafe was one of those, and again, no judgment, but there has been this trend, and you've seen it too, where people choose to eschew. I'd like to use that word in conversation, or like, eliminate words like latte cappuccino from their menus completely. And there have been some places. I think that the first that I remember distinctly doing this was Ninth Street Espresso in New York, and I think that Gwilym Davies did something like this too at Prufrock in the
Hmm.
UK. This idea of forget the names of these drinks because they're confusing. Let's just say milk plus coffee 5 ounce, milk plus coffee 10 ounce, and
Yeah.
that's sort of like by removing the names of those drinks from cappuccino, cafe latte, that I don't know. I don't even. I mean, they're not here to defend themselves, but I'm not completely sure what the point was. But that kind of like the way that you expressed frustration at the beginning of this conversation, that there was some frustration on their part that they were trying to kind of address or deal with. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, like I think myself and Willem were working quite closely at the time. So we were doing some work for Nuova Sinelli at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and then we were competing at the same time. And then also, we both opened up shops on carts in other people's premises. So he opened up in a clothes shop, and I opened up in Twisted Pepper. So we both kind of had a shot to nothing at the time, and also, I suppose, both had a streak of mischief and a shot to nothing in both situations. So we're like, oh, wouldn't this be funny if we did this? So I think we're probably co-conspirators on that kind of thing. And I think like it's definitely a decision that I made at the time out of naivety and trying to be a little bit standoffish and kind of cool,
Differentiate.
I suppose. Yeah, yeah, like it was like a bit edgy, you know. And now I'm 38 and I'm a little older and wiser, and like I like I said to one of our staff recently, he's like, wouldn't it be really cool if we did have a go at defining, like if we did define our ideal espresso, cappuccino, latte, flat white, cortado, macchiato. Am I missing some other ones? I don't know. And get specific cups and glassware
Mm-hmm.
for those drinks, and then do that. Wouldn't that be really cool? And then like the younger member of staff is looking at me going, that would not be cool. I'm like, okay, right, you know. But like, I suppose you're at different stages of life. You think these things are quite interesting. But for me, that would be quite interesting to do now. But at the time, I suppose trying to do something that would differentiate you from the Starbucks or the Costa or whatever else was out there was probably the main driver behind all that.
Right.
And
Differentiation.
yeah, and delivering something that people weren't used to as well. Because if we did something that was very similar or even slightly different to what Starbucks do, we're dead in the water. You had to do something that was drastically different, which gave people an idea that you were very different to what they were doing in the first
Right.
place.
How is that? I mean, that's been a really important part, right, of the sort of like the story of third wave coffee is how much energy is spent in differentiating versus meeting the customer's needs, in a classic sense. And we don't talk about this very much, but there are times where like our industry feels like, it's just full of misfits and college dropouts and whatever, because very often there is a bit of a correlation between people who work in coffee and people who don't want rules, of any
Mm.
kind, and a little bit of thumbing their nose at like large corporations like Starbucks or whatever, like feels like revolutionary, to be a barista. Sometimes you're pushing against like those big corporate entities.
Yeah, it was like starting a band when I got into it.
Right.
It was just, I couldn't play an instrument, so I learned how to make coffee. It's
Right.
like
So you're
it
gonna
was a
start your
very
own
similar thing.
own band and make music like everyone else that you've heard before. So
Yeah.
so there is that kind of paradox. And yeah, when it comes to cappuccino, it's interesting when you think about this, right? That at least at the beginning of this sort of third wave era, that the differentiation was in recapturing a traditional kind of classic. It almost felt like resurrecting something that was lost.
Yeah.
Like archaeology. Like we're all like Indiana Jones. We're gonna unearth this thing. It's like, oh, the cappuccino is back. Like I'm gonna bring it from the dusty, realm and bring it to you, my,
And
customer person.
and do you think that that was well established and defined for a long time? Because we like you find this in like culturally in Ireland we do this a lot where we have an ideal of what it is to be Irish and we try to, oh, we should be like this again, but when you scratch the surface you kind of realize that we were never like that in the first place.
Right.
Like especially in like the 30s and 40s there was and even before that there was a strong push, mostly amongst very rich poets, to define this Irishness, what it meant to be Irish. And usually what Irishness was not British.
Right.
Okay. And then this is what we did, and this is who we were as people. And but then really, when you scratch the surface, we weren't like that at all. And I don't know if this cappuccino ideal that we talk about, I don't know. I'm not an Italian. I wasn't around in Italy in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But is this how we see that cappuccino and how it should be made? Did that actually exist? And was it a thing that we were resurrecting? Or was it just you know, a made up shot at
Right.
nostalgia?
Like wear a red hat, make cappuccino great again. Right.
Well,
I
because
mean,
technically it's an Austrian thing, though, eh?
is it?
Yeah, well, I don't really know who to believe
Yeah.
anymore, but the whole idea of the Capuchin monks was
Right.
Viennese, and it's just coffee mixed with milk until it looks the same color as the cloth.
Right. 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 So, I mean, in a lot of ways, it felt like you're right. Like the way that manifests itself, that effect you're talking about, this idea of trying to go back to something, but actually not. My hair is all weird. Um, Not
Your
actually
hair
be.
looks great.
Thank you. I got a perm. I got a perm again last week. Um, the idea of trying to recapture this bygone thing, but having like fundamentally having it not be what you think it is. Uh, I mean, starting with the idea that like the structure of the cappuccino might be like kind of like an Italian one, but that
Hmm.
when the espresso itself is different, like when the sort of mindset, the paradigm going into it, the espresso itself is like coming from a different place, right? So for
Yeah.
the America in the U.S., I've always said from the beginning that the United States fundamentally is a filter coffee drinking culture, and that
Hmm.
espresso was a kind of offshoot of that. It was like a more milky, more like a sort of a deeper, in ways, and in other ways more shallow, but like fundamentally like a milky, creamier version of coffee. But that excuse me, what Americans tend to sort of like the platonic understanding, the platonic ideal of coffee is filter coffee. So for a lot of like the third wave movement in the US, like it really was about like how do I capture everything I like about filter coffee, but in a very concentrated sort of 1-2 ounce sort of
Hmm.
form. Whereas in Italy, there isn't that legacy, there isn't that baggage, there isn't that kind of side goal, right? Like it's its own thing, and you know, I haven't been to Italy in a while, but like we experienced it more when Italians come into our cafes and they have a shot of espresso and they're like, "This is not espresso," you know
Yeah.
you know and it's not even like they don't say this is not the kind I like, this is not the style I like, or like I don't like this kind, something like that, a more someone who's not from Italy might say like this is too bitter for me, this is too sour for me, something like that, this is too thin, this is too
Yeah.
heavy. But the Italians will just straight up say this is not espresso, right?
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
is to me, like, as we do very often in our cafes, like we have to decode that, like what does that actually mean? And it's not that they're calling bullshit on what we're doing per se, it's like they're expressing that there's something that's like intrinsically missing here, like you're almost like it's almost like you're missing the point.
Yeah. I actually, well, I think from the Italian perspective, I experienced this for the first time in 2009 when I went to host to the show in Milan,
Mm.
which is it's an
Everyone talks
exhibition
about
center
it.
about the size of Ireland, and and I'd go there, and there would be lots of people that I would know internationally from competitions from Australia and the
Sure.
US, and and you'd be like, great, and they'd taste like, oh, this is great, and then the Italians would come over and say, this is not espresso, and there's, I suppose, from their perspective, espresso was theirs. They invented it. This is how it's done. It's a very specific way. It's how it's done. And what you're doing is not that, so therefore it isn't called espresso, which I get. But they would have no awareness of what you were or what you were doing. We went to, I remember, I can't remember the name of it now, but quite a large roastery in Genoa in the north of Italy on a trip. They were fascinated by us. It was myself and the other five finalists in the World Barista Championships, and they were like, their attitude was like in a very respectful and friendly way, but like, who told you you could have a World Championships without
Right,
asking us?
right.
You know, they just thought it was hilarious, and they were incredibly generous and kind and very warm people. But they were just like, no, it would be like if I was holding the Nick Cho of the Year awards
Right.
and you weren't invited. You know what I mean? Uh,
Yeah.
and they were just like, "This is hilarious. How could you possibly do this without our say so?" Which I can also get. But to them, it's a very defined thing, and if you're not doing that, it's not even close.
Right. Right. I mean, this is where it's like, again, like not to get into the competition thing too much, but I've long said that the barista competitions, the direction that it went in, um, this just happens to be the way my brain works. Like I've been thinking for a while about it. Didn't have to go that way. It could have gone a different way. It could, when the barista
Hmm.
competitions started, and when we say barista competitions for folks watching, like we're talking about the World Barista Championship and all the structure that sort of feeds into it. Been around since the year 2000 with Robert Thorson as its first champion. The first 3 or 4 years was still very Italian in a lot of ways. Like it was very rooted in, like, I think that it one of the early years, like Tim Wendelbo used Illy Cafe Espresso, in the
Hmm.
competition. That there was still very much this sort of like this anchoring, this rooting in Italian espresso, and that could have continued. That if the I would say that if the Italians were more involved with the competitions directly, which they weren't, like in the leadership,
Hmm.
in the design of things, like they really weren't. It was Scandinavians, people from Norway, specifically Norway and Denmark, some from Iceland and Sweden as well, but and a bunch of Americans, that once that group got their hands on it, uh, which is again like the where it came from. It originally came from Norway, I guess, but that because it went that way, it kind of went on a certain trajectory. Whereas if Italians were more involved from the beginning, or even like in that early era, that the whole of specialty coffee could actually look different. If that's held up as the crown jewel of specialty coffee, that maybe it would have actually been a little bit more in consortium with like Italian coffee culture. Maybe it would have informed Italian coffee culture more than it has. But instead, as you've described, like it became this whole spin-off, like almost like an alternate reality when it comes to
Yeah, but
these
I feel like
traditions.
there was almost like a sense that people were almost getting a kick out of how un-Italian it was at a certain stage. So, like when you went to Italy and it was very different to what we did in competition or in our shops, it was almost like there was almost a buzz out of that, which is a really weird thing to admit. Um, and when you go to Italy now, it's funny because in most cities there are specialty coffee shops, and Italians are very slowly coming on board with it. I don't think they will ever really fully come on board with
Y-
it. But it's interesting to see that happening. But to come back to your point about espresso and somebody saying this is not espresso, it's I think definitely in 2000, in the mid 2000s, there was the point of espresso was different. And I know it's supposed to be talking about cappuccino here, but bear with me.
No, yeah.
But espresso was to me, and I remember this thing about it was the perfect mix of sweet, salt, savory, and bitterness and that kind of, yeah.
I mean, that
But
was that was the barista competition standard, right? It
yeah,
was in the
yeah, yeah,
rules.
yeah. But it was definitely, let's say, complex and whole. Okay,
Hmm.
so there was an element of fullness in flavor to it. Okay, and then as then we had the debate about single origins, and then everybody started. Then it got into processing of single origins,
Well,
and that
the single
and
origins
then
meaning like that you couldn't do. Originally, people thought like you can't do single origin for espresso. It
oh,
just didn't work.
yeah, it can't be balanced. Yeah,
Right.
and then once we established that you could, if you wanted to do a single
All you
origin,
have
it
to do
became
is
about
change your
process.
definition of balance, and it was fine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you have processes, different processes of single origins, and then it became baristas telling farmers what to do. Uh, and it's like this evolution happened then as well. Now, and somewhere in this route, in coffee shops and barista competitions around the world, it, espresso, or the drink that we sold, became and how we pull those shots, okay, became an exploration and reflection of what that coffee was. All
Right.
right, which is different to what espresso is. Espresso is
Right.
a complex coffee drink of many different aspects that gives you a certain experience.
Right.
And that is now lost in a lot of espresso that you get in specialty coffee shops.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for the analogy that I've used for a long time with that is in the United States, espresso sort of occupy in the pantheon of food and beverage, espresso sort of occupies a similar space to sushi. Okay. So it's fundamentally a foreign cuisine, but at this point in our history, it's everywhere. You can get it anywhere. And in fact, like you can get a sushi burrito, like sushi burrito. You can get all types of sort of like fun kind of local spins on that general idea of fish or raw fish and vegetables with rice or vinegared rice and the rice, the what do you call it, seaweed nori, whatever you want to call it, like some combinations of those things. But yeah, so for Americans, it's kind of like sushi, but that in Italy, it's not their sushi at all. It's more like a hamburger, like an American hamburger in
Mm.
America. In other words, if you kind of made a hamburger really fancy, an American would very often look at that and go, "That's not a hamburger." Right?
Yeah.
Like it's not bun patty bun with, like it's not the structure of a hamburger, or there's something about it that doesn't hit fundamentally. There's something about it that the consumption of it doesn't satisfy me the way that I wanted out of a hamburger, in terms of the expectation. So this gets back to
Yeah.
cappuccino, right? Like this idea of if someone asks for a cappuccino, like what are they going to get? So I'm interested, just like if you don't mind me like changing the subject back to that a little bit, that like there is this tension when it comes to anything. So if I walk in, and there's a lot of different versions of this, right? Where it's like I bring in my understanding of my history with those terms and those ideas that the term refers to, and
Hmm.
you all have your understanding and like definitions and understanding of those sorts of things. And so, um, how do you, like you said? your younger baristas really pushed back on the idea of very strict definitions. Then if someone asks for a cappuccino, then what are you producing for them?
Um, so like, where do I start with this? I suppose to very briefly go back to the previous point about espresso,
Hmm.
the espresso that we drank that was complex and whole and had all of those elements to it,
Right.
had then a specific relationship with the milk that you poured into it,
Absolutely.
and that has also changed
Yes. Yes.
quite dramatically. And as a coffee roaster, I'm sure you've been down this road before. Is that so you sometimes end up in positions where, like, I had a coffee this morning. I snuck into the shop early doors and made myself a cappuccino, which was delicious. You can find it on my Instagram stories. And it's espresso that I probably wouldn't be hugely fond of,
Mm.
um, but it makes an incredible cappuccino. And this is the weird thing, is that like a lot of the espressos that you could make are incredibly well suited to milk drinks, but that's for a long time. I'm only getting to stage now of maturity and experience where I can kind of have these conversations with myself. But when I was 27, I'd be just like, no, everything is great with everything, when that's not really the truth.
Right.
So for me, if you come to our shops, we will actually, this is, I suppose, slightly strange. We have two different ways of making espresso. One of them is slightly longer than the other.
Hmm.
The first one, the longer one, is you have 18-gram dose, and I think to like 36 gram. That's what we would give you if you serve you an espresso,
Hmm.
and that is that reflection of the variety of process and terroir, as opposed to what traditional espresso is. And then we pull that shot slightly shorter for a milk drink because we find that the shorter espresso shot works better and mixes better with the milk to give you that fuller flavor through the milk.
Hmm.
Because if the espresso is too diluted, you don't get that same intensity through it.
Is it just
So that's what
about
we
when you
do.
cut the shot, or do you like dose or grind it differently?
No, no, we just cut the shot
Hmm.
shorter. Yeah. So it's I think so. So about 18 to 32 grams, I think it is, which
Hmm.
is about one and a half, I suppose. Um, um, and you would then, and this is the thing, because like in Ireland, you can get, it's very easy to get 8 ounce paper cups, which is like the smallest paper cup that we serve.
Hmm.
You can now actually get 5 and 6, but we haven't got them. We don't use them in the shops. But if you buy the cappuccino like to sit in, which we're not doing at the moment because of COVID-19, but
Right.
ordinarily you'd get it in a 6 ounce porcelain cup, but that same espresso shot. So the ratios of milk between the paper cup and the porcelain cup are quite different.
Mm.
And so anyway, if you came to visit my shop, I would pull you a shot that's like 18 to 32 grams and serve it in a 6 ounce cup. Probably a little less foamy than most people would define cappuccino, I would
Hmm.
say. I'd like still to have a good degree of silkiness, but like I suppose melted ice cream, I think, is the best to give you a bit of glucose in any sort of way. And where most of the baristas that work for me, work for us differ from me is I like to. They do this thing, and maybe you do the same, where you drop a little bit of milk in, and you stir the. I think Schomer started this. You spin the espresso milk around, and then you pour the rest of the latte art in,
Right.
or cappuccino art. I actually like to just leave the edges, so it is. I like that little bit of, can I call it dirtiness or bitterness on the edge?
Hmm.
I like that, and then also I like it to be probably a degree or two above, I suppose, what competition would expect for temperature, because
Uh-huh.
I like just a bit of a bite. You know what I
Right.
mean? Just a little bit of bite in temperature, because I also feel that you should it's, I mean, you can let a cappuccino cool down, but you can't let it heat up. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, so if it's a little bit too hot, so, but I like a little bit of bite in the cappuccino. I really really detest like body temperature cappuccinos.
I mean, so let's get into that. So there's a whole host of things that people like you and I know have their origins in like barista competition culture. But what I'm
Hmm.
always have to remind myself is that like that's still the majority of baristas out there who are even working at third wave cafes don't understand, don't know anything about competition, and don't kind of care.
And those rules are gone now as well, eh?
Sure, they are, though. Like they still persist in a lot of ways. I think. Um, I mean, in a way, when you take the rules away, it's not like everything then kind of goes like everything changes. It's like there's still that legacy in a lot of ways. And so what I found, so there's a story that I think is relevant. So my understanding of a cappuccino, like in a cup like this, was always,
Hmm.
originally and to some degree even to this day, is that you put espresso goes in this way, not on the bottom, so and that when we pour it and let it settle out, usually I'll tell a barista like from a quarter to a third of the vertical distance is foam, is
Hmm.
a pretty like it's on the foamy side, and maybe you could call that a certain sort of traditional if you had to like name it, but that that's a certain style, and that it was my understanding and the understanding of a lot of people in the competition world that was sort of that was like a competition cappuccino standard. Like people talked about drink a thirds, and so that
Yeah.
perception of being about a third, anything beyond that, if it was like a half. I mean, if a half of the distance is actually like two-thirds of the volume, so you got
Yeah,
to
yeah,
kind of be
yeah.
careful
Because it's
about that, right?
tapered. Yeah.
Because it's tapered, right? So that all said, the key moment was in 2008. In 2008, after the Copenhagen World Barista Championship that Stephen Morrissey won, woo, Ireland.
Go Steamo.
So uh, at the time, after every competition, there would be like this council of elders of barista competition would come together and have a discussion of the rules. And um, rules of barista competition is a whole other topic, obviously, and how they're determined. But at the time, it was kind of determined through this process, and then afterwards, someone would be tasked with codifying it in the rules. And for a couple of years, that was actually me. That would
Hmm.
then take it and put it into the rules. It's kind of how I got trained myself to some degree on the how to write rules and regulations. That then I could write the rules for Brewers Cup. But so I remember distinctly, like, there were a bunch of different topics that year, and one of them was, there had been a lot of debate among judges about milk foam and what was appropriate and what was not in terms of depth and stuff. And so it was to the point where it wasn't fair for the competitors, depending on who you would get. And,
Yeah.
and that's not really fair. There need to be some standardization, at least some like understanding, or at least at the very least some discussion. So I raised the topic. I said, let's talk about milk foam depth on the cappuccino. And we said, let's just set something. So we have these standards for other things. Why not for this? And so everyone agreed. And we said, okay, so if you had to articulate the depth of foam, what should it be? And right away, someone said 1 centimeter of depth. And my immediate response, and a lot of people, was that's very shallow. That's, just like that. That's like, for us,
Yeah.
it was more like the idea of what we conceived of as a latte. And it was an Australian person who said this. I don't remember who it was, but I remember they were Australian. And said, well, that's really shallow. And then said, well, let's go to the next person. What do you say? And they were a European person, and they said 1 centimeter. And I was like, wait a second. So we went all the way around and sort of like took a poll of sorts. And in that room, being like roughly 65%, like, I would say like 35% Americans and the rest from other parts of the world. And about just over half said 1 centimeter. And it was one of those moments where it's just like I had no idea that this was like occurring in people's minds and that in other people's countries and such. And so the consensus was if that's the standard in most of the world except outside of the US, then the US people have to kind of give up, in that situation and give in and say like if we're going to have a standard, then let that be the thing. So that's where the 1 centimeter rule came from, was in that moment.
And did it
Um,
have to be at least 1 centimeter, or was it like maximum 1 centimeter, or
that
was it?
1 centimeter, what I mean, that was also discussed, and it just ended up being like because I needed clarification. I asked the exact same question, like, you mean at least 1 centimeter, right? They were like, no, we mean like 1 centimeter is the right foam depth. So, had to set our arrogant Americanness aside and say like, well, if that's the consensus in the room, then that's meaningful. And so we codified it in the rules. And the 1 centimeter foam depth on the cappuccino was, was the thing from that point on. What was really
So
interesting was the way that interplayed with latte art, and the idea that you can
yes,
get much more precise latte art out of thin milk foam, which is, I mean, you know
yeah.
what I'm getting at.
Well, like so in 2008, probably well actually because that would have been like March 2008, was it?
Summer.
Yeah, somewhere. So around about that time, I was sitting in an office in the
Meanwhile,
financial
dot dot
services
dot.
centre in Dublin,
Yeah.
looking at a video of a place in London called Flat White. And I saw this video on this website saying there's this really cool coffee shop that's opened up in London. And I was kind of getting interested in coffee then. And I clicked on it, I watched the video, and I remember watching the video going, what are they doing on the top of that coffee? That is incredible. I want to do the thing that they do on the top of the
Yeah.
coffee.
It's
And
just
I
boom.
like
Yeah.
very much just booked a flight to London very soon after that to go and see what they were doing on top of their coffee. And I went in one day, and there was a guy whose name escapes me now. And his name was like Brad or Thor or something cool like that. And he he saw me looking at the thing he was doing on his coffee, and he said, "You can stand at the edge of the bar and watch me do the thing on the coffee if you want." I was like, "Could I?" So for an hour, I stood there and watched him do the thing with the coffee, and customers thought I was weird. But that is what I think a lot of the time is what drove the marketing side of specialty coffee, or it was when you handed somebody a cup and they looked down at the wonderful patterns that you
Yep.
did on the cup, they're like, "Oh, what is this amazing thing?" You know the one
Yep.
they go, "Did you mean to do that?" And
Yep.
you're like, "I did."
Yeah. Yeah. Just for you.
Undoubtedly,
Wink.
that's
Right.
what's driven
Right.
that. Undoubtedly, yeah, and and that I suppose hasn't really gone away, has it?
Yeah. So I mean, in that way, it's like with the sort of third wave cafe sector, that it really does put a lot of the power over the drink standards in the hands of the baristas, either on the individual level or in the collective, right? Like we've all experienced a situation where you have a barista that has some training from somewhere else. I mean, this is more of a more recent phenomenon in the past 10, 15 years, but where, when I started, there was no such thing as having experience somewhere else that was relevant, right? But that, when somebody does and you realize like, oh, they're quietly doing their own thing over in the corner. They think that no one else notices. At least they're trying to anyway. And then you kind of have to manage that out if you kind of catch it. But that all said, like ultimately that individual has a lot of power in that situation as well as in the collective. You and I are sadly somewhat of an anomaly, are a rare thing in the industry in terms of being the principals of our companies and also like effectively like the lead barista. Like we're like the head
Mhm.
chef, who actually establishes standards. There are a lot of other companies who are beholden to this team of baristas, or at least like a trainer, coffee director, whatever, who is not a principal in the company but has the power over standards and such in the company. And so it's been interesting watching that phenomenon take hold, where the milk foam gets thinner and thinner and thinner as the baristas are enjoying more and more of being able to make intricate latte art patterns. Because again, for those who are watching who don't know about this, you can make latte art out of thicker foam. It's just not as precise and intricate. And so,
Yeah.
there's a certain economic force, right? Like a certain incentivization that takes a hold and pushes that milk really thin, to where now it's really hard to find at a lot of most cities a third wave shop where someone's making a thicker milk foam drink by default if you don't ask for it specially. And then when they do, if they do it for you, like they're doing it begrudgingly.
Oh, so what is the cappuccino that Nick Cho makes for me if I go to Wrecking Ball tomorrow?
It's 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 kind of what I described. It's so the way that I approached it, because we started Wrecking Ball, we opened our cafe in 2015. So 15 years after, almost 15 years after I opened my first cafe. And for that matter, like 15 years into whatever this sort of third wave era is. So you know, it's kind of cheesy, but a lot of the idea behind the name Wrecking Ball is really like kind of to remind us to sort of revisit everything and not just take things for granted just because. And that's part of who Trish and I are, and it's part of what we want that culture to be at Wrecking Ball, to kind of question everything and revisit it. And so with something like a cappuccino, then the question became like, well, how are we going to approach this? So the way we chose to approach it is, and I'm proselytizing a little bit here, but you know, I'll let it go. Like the question was, what do people want when they want a cappuccino? Let's start with that question. What do people want when they want coffee? Like what is that thing? And I think for a lot of people, that question is a frustrating question for anyone. But I think for a lot of people, that frustration makes them want to avoid it or kind of run from it. Whereas for me, like the truth is in that question, and all the frustrations of that question and trying to answer that question are all the frustrations with human beings and with people.
Hmm.
And if that's where that truth lies, then that's where I want to go. So like I ran right into it, and that idea of embracing the disappointment, but fundamentally like that idea, and it's a little bit, I hate this sort of like Silicon Valley-ness of it, but like there is that sort of Steve Jobs thing that is attributed to him, that like when it comes to like the iPhone or whatever, or like these inventions, that it some kind of quote similar to like, it's not the consumer's job to know what they want, it's our job. So I think that that's reference usually to the idea that Apple wasn't doing any kind of consumer testing or consumer research for their products. And I really embrace that idea. I do think that in a lot of corporate settings that consumer research ends up being overvalued at times, just like polls are very often when it comes to politics, right? Like, be it Brexit or Trump or whatever, like the role of polls in that and the way that it misled people in terms of like what a false sense of whatever. It has a lot to do with the science of polling and such and such. So similarly, it's like, do I have it within me to sort of like go into that? Just like a lot of any relationships, like what do people want in a friend? What do people need from me as a father? Like, what do my kids want? What does TikTok want in like your Korean dad? Kind of thing, like world. Like those things are all questions that I feel like our culture doesn't. It's an inconvenient and frustrating one, so we tend to run from it. But so we chose to run into it, and that's kind of how we tend to. It informs almost everything that we do. What do people want when they want blank?
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that we give them like the lowest common denominator version of that, but that's the starting point for us, and that we want to scratch that itch. The thing I always say is like, if someone says like, will you scratch my back, it's itchy, and then you go, I only scratch elbows around here, we only scratch elbows, and I'm happy to scratch your elbow for you. Fundamentally, you might, then the person walks away frustrated, and it's like, what's their problem, kind of thing. It's like, well, what just happened there? Somebody asked
Yeah.
for something and you said no, I refuse, I could but I won't, I choose not to. That's the sort of implicit message there. And I don't want to treat people that way.
Because yeah, we did
Not
that. We did a
anymore.
lot of that as an industry early doors, though, didn't we?
Right.
It's just, oh, we don't do that, we don't do this, we don't do that. And
Right.
there's a lot of decisions that we made, I think, in our business early on that I'm kind of embarrassed about at the start.
Yeah.
And
It's
it's
growing
funny
pains.
because you see people talk about the mainstreaming of specialized specialty coffee,
Yes.
but then also the specializing of mainstream coffee, and the two of them are kind of converging into one point,
Absolutely.
I think, as well. And I think it's funny because we the last 10, 15, 20 years have been about, oh, we want to get really great coffee to lots of different people. But then when that happens, people seem strangely upset about it. Like, did you actually want to just stay really niche, or did you actually want to do this? But I know what
Mm.
you mean, because at the same time, you have to meet people's expectations. But also, if you're going to do something that is specialist and is coming from a perspective of quality, the customer, they need to know that they're in on your interpretation of this. And like, if you go to a great restaurant, you're like, I'm here for dinner. You know what I mean? And
Mm.
like,
I'm in
over
your
here in
hands, kind of
ramen
thing.
or
Yeah.
pizza or hamburger, I have I suppose what are important fundamentals, and then there's other stuff that you can play around with at the end. And I think the important fundamentals of cappuccino are probably obvious. And then after that, I'm really looking forward to what Nick Cho will make us, or what, I don't know, anybody else will
Well, to
make.
get into that more, I mean, so for me, I've thought of like this is how I think about cappuccino. So if I want a, and this is just again just me like a flat white is something that's like basically like a cappuccino but with less milk foam is essentially like a flat white. Same temperature, same everything, just less milk foam. So if a cappuccino is a cappuccino, like what do I want that to be? Like again, what do people want when they want it? Like if you ask the average person who has any kind of familiarity with these things, then they're gonna talk about milk foam. And so
Yeah, yeah,
for me, it's like having that foam is important. Having it be like pretty tight and silky is important. Because that's kind of what we do in the third wave sector. We don't do the bubble bath kind of foam. But I think a lot about stuff like how much you open your mouth when you sip it, and how like I always think about how when you sip it, like I want you people to be able to open it like a reasonable amount, whatever the hell that means, and for like it to be foam and liquid kind of like simultaneously entering their mouth like together, kind of thing.
yeah.
I think
I
about
get
that and how to achieve that sort of balance in that way so it's sippable. Because, as you know, it's like when it's foamed like that, it does have like a sweetness to it
yeah,
that the
yeah. The
liquid version
texture,
doesn't
and
have.
I'm gonna be very, I'm gonna be the ultimate stereotype here, but it's very similar with a pint of Guinness.
Right.
And like, if anyone's watching this and has
Yeah.
Instagram, you should go and follow Shit London Guinness, which is an Instagram account by an Irish guy living in the UK who goes around taking pictures and posting pictures that other people have sent of really badly poured pints of Guinness. Which I suppose I am now the angry Italian in your coffee shop going, but instead
Right.
of that's not an espresso, that's not a pint of Guinness.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing, is that there has to be a degree of foam that hits the back of your throat with the rest of the stout. Has to be a certain temperature, has to be served in a certain glass. And when you go to London, they don't do that.
The thing
So
on that note that really, I don't know if this even registers for you, but that really blew my mind about Guinness and a lot of Irish beers in Ireland was that the branding of it is so different. Like I would never have expected that. That the logos are more modern in Ireland, and I've never seen that anywhere else. Because like there's this, I see you're kind of cocking your head like you don't even notice this, do you? Like when you go elsewhere, it's an older logo from like 30 years ago. But when you look at the Guinness logos like in the bars and in the pubs in Dublin, that
mhm.
like for every Irish beer that I recognized, like I had to look at it twice because it was like a more evolved, more modern logo. And realizing that in Ireland, this is not some kind of throwback old country kind of idea of like it's a thing that lives and breathes. So like for me the equivalent is when I go to Korea, and Korean food for me is very much like a classic sort of food from my family. But when I go to Korea and I see modern takes on it, it's like, oh my gosh, life goes on. It doesn't,
Yeah,
whereas a lot of other places, this idea of Ireland is this quaint leprechauns and Guinness and like whatever kind of story, fairy tale idea that like you all live and breathe like life goes on. Like Dublin's a super modern
yeah, yeah.
city.
Well, because I think for a lot of people, especially in the US, we're going way off topic now, but
Yeah,
like Irish people landed in the US maybe in the late 1800s during famine times, but also like up until the start of the 1900s. And there was a shillelagh and leprechaun kind of ideal of what that Irish person was.
right,
And that kind of crystallized and stayed that way and manifested itself into Patrick's Day parades, which is actually an American tradition, not an Irish
right.
tradition, and still goes there. And it's funny because sometimes when I go to the US and I visit people and they want to go drinking in Irish bars with me, and I really don't want to do that. It's very disappointing to them.
Yeah, don't take me to
They're
Korean
like,
restaurants in Dublin if I visit, please. Yeah.
yeah, and there's an ideal there where like it's kind of hard to actually like I look at the Fighting Irish, the Notre Dame thing,
Uh-huh.
and I don't really, I don't associate myself with that at
Right.
all. You know what I mean? And it's a weird thing
Is it
because I think
offensive to you?
is it it's more annoying than offensive. I think a lot of people that have like cultural
Oh, that's
stereotypes have a lot
interesting.
more to do with than white Irish people. You know, like it's there's definitely been over the years a very anti-Irish thing that's happened, but it doesn't really matter anymore. I think it's not really a huge thing for us
I love
in
that
comparison to
idea
other
that
countries.
something like that kind of cultural appropriation minus like the racism part equals just it's just annoyance. It's just
Yeah,
annoying.
yeah,
It's interesting.
yeah.
It's
Like
interesting.
it's or like if you go to some parts of the world, they'll just every second person will ask you if you've had a potato today, and then laugh. And go, yeah, that's kind of funny. Maybe I don't
Right.
know, but again, like it's not going to stop me getting a job or something.
Yeah.
So I'm not.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah. Yeah.
important. But
Yeah.
it's the same. But with the Italian thing, it's kind of like it feels like the inverse has happened because the cappuccino landed in Staten Island and then evolved past something else, and landed in Botany Bay and landed in I don't know whatever the port in London is, and evolved into something else. But in Italy, it stayed what it was.
Right.
Whereas what we're talking about is like, is it an identity landing
I
in
mean,
these countries?
it's
And
still evolved, right? There's
well,
still an evolution.
In Italy, the cappuccino is definitely very similar to what it, and their idea of what the cappuccino is very similar today to what it was probably in the 30s.
Well, I think that, when it comes to foodways, one of the things that comes up a lot is with globalization. Like, what's lost in the conversation about globalization is that there's also that globalization effect, but on a smaller scale, right? So, like, a regional cuisine kind of gets lost in the idea of that country being a little bit more like nationalized, if there's such a
Hmm.
thing. So, it makes sense that if you have espresso machines and before like the internet and even before like sort of like modern times that there would be sort of these regional ideas. I mean, for us, we talk about Italian, like this concept of Northern Italian espresso versus Southern Italian espresso, with this sort of mythology of that, and the ways that when you talk to Italians, like, is there really that distinction? And they're like, sort of not. Like people want to draw that distinction because you can kind of have a similar sort of like there's a similar sort of effect when it comes to their food, right? There's like Northern Italian food, there's Southern Italian food, and those things have regional differences. Yeah, like
But
Chinese, like Sichuan versus Hunan, like et cetera, et cetera.
Italy was very much like for even until modern history was not one whole country either. And then for a long time, it's back into the Roman Empire. It's still like you had towns on either sides of mountains that you just would never speak to each other.
Right.
It's a very, very, regionalized thing. And if you sit down 10 people from broadly the same area and ask them to make a ragu, they would, argue vehemently about what the constituents of that recipe should be.
Right.
Um, which again brings it back to the cappuccino because to then say there is an Italian cappuccino that is very clearly defined and
Right.
everybody in Italy agrees. Anyone that spent any time in Italy knows that they're not going to agree. It's just that's what makes them amazing.
Right. I mean, it would be absurd, but in a lot of ways more productive if someone said, like, I want you to make a cappuccino the way that, like, Il Caffè San Eustachio makes in Rome. Like, one specific, like, shop or cafe, like that would make more sense. But yeah, when you try to
Yeah,
define it in a larger, I mean, this again happens all the time with food and foods from different cultures. Like there is that kind of cultural tourism effect where it's like you want to kind of create this platonic idea of like the ultimate pizza or the ultimate kimchi or like
hmm
whatever, when it doesn't work that way. But also though there is something that they're asking for, that they're wanting. And yeah, like there was a whole article, I think it was in the New York Times, specifically about bagels in San Francisco many years ago. And it was really talking about this idea that like people carry around this memory, this taste memory of a certain
yeah.
and of an experience. And that when that haunts you for the rest of your life and you're just trying to recreate that it becomes a sort of foolish kind of endeavor. And so, I getting back to the cappuccino, like I very much recognize and sympathize with baristas for whom that's the thing that you're coming against, right? That's the thing that you're facing is someone had a crush on a barista who made them a cappuccino once, and they were like googly eyed, like, "Oh, this is the best cappuccino I ever had. Can you make that? Can you make me fall in love again here in San
Yeah.
Francisco?" And it's like, are you kidding? That's not fair.
Yeah, and I suppose like it becomes down to like there is a it's an Italian cappuccino. It's just the way it was in proper Italy, and like trying to get hold of that thing, and because maybe it does exist, maybe it doesn't exist. I had a very similar experience in Moscow, in
Mm.
Russia. Um, and I got off. I went to this show. I think it's called the Peer Show, and it's again a massive show. And they asked me to come and do a coffee talk. And then while I was there, they said, "Oh, you also have to do a demonstration tomorrow." I was like, "Okay, yeah, well, you've brought me here for a few days. I'll do it." And I said, "What's the demonstration?" They were like, "Irish coffee." I said, "What?" I said, Irish coffee. Like, I
What
don't
what good is
know
an
how to make
Irishman
Irish
if we can't
coffee.
have Irish coffee demo?
They're like, "But you're from Ireland." I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, just do it the way you usually do it." I'm like, "I don't usually do it." They would not take no for an answer. Okay, I think they'd been told probably by Giovanni Ficini, if he's watching, but that I could do it because I was getting that impression of them. So anyway, there happened to be a Jameson stand, which is an Irish whiskey brand, and I knew somebody who was working there just by chance. So I went and asked him. He gave me a bottle of Jameson. And I said, "Well, I get up tomorrow and I'll do it." So they put the headpiece on me, just like at the barista competition. And they brought me on the stage. And I got on stage. And as I walked onto the stage, there must have been 500
Oh my god.
bartenders taking notes. Okay. Now,
Terrifying.
this this is where I took advantage of the absurdity. Okay. I had a vague idea of how to make Irish coffees from having worked in restaurants in Ireland. And for anyone that's never been to Ireland, it's not really a thing here. If you ask me where the best Irish coffee in Dublin was, I don't really know where you'd get one. I mean, you get
It comes
awful
from
ones in some
here. It comes
places,
from
but
San Francisco.
yeah, well, there's a debate about whether it came from the west of Ireland or San Francisco. It definitely
Oh,
came from
really?
San Francisco. I mean, it's not a thing here. And then I'm gonna get in trouble for that. So I get up on the stage. I like get a glass that they just had there. I put some sugar in, put some whiskey in, put some coffee in, and the guy's like, "Oh, you're adding the coffee after the whiskey?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, always." And he's like, "Why?" I was like, "Oh," and just making up as I go along. Okay. So then I get the cream and I'm like shaking the cream. And like, anyway, this is the tricky bit that if you overshake the cream, it just sticks
Right.
in the bottle and it won't come out. And
Right.
if you don't shake it enough,
It's
it just
liquid.
comes out, like pours out
Right.
in liquid. And there's a very tight window in between. So of course I shook it, not enough. Poured it into the thing, and the thing just goes brown. Okay, so it just looks absolutely awful. Okay, so I'm just like completely po-faced, and the guy's like, "So you don't settle the cream on top?" And I was like, "No, well, internationally, people think that that's how an Irish coffee should be made, but in the homeland, this is how we do it."
In the
And
old country.
I could see all these Russian bartenders going, "Oh," and taking notes and
Oh
all this.
my
And
god.
maybe, okay, to this day, there is an underground niche group of like high end bartenders making muddy, awful looking Irish coffees the traditional Irish way.
Oh,
That
I'm
might be
sure
happening.
there. I mean, I guess this is a stereotype. I shouldn't go there, but like, I'm sure there have been like fist fights about this. No, I learned it
Oh,
from an Irishman. That's
it's yeah. I don't know. Like there's a coast where like the boat planes used to land. In I think it's called Golden. It's in Limerick, I think, and
mhm.
apparently that's where the first one was made. But yeah, no, it's an American thing.
I mean, if there was, then there'd be a name for it, right? Like that, a local name for it, because they're not going to call it Irish coffee. It would just be called coffee.
Well, it's like we had, yeah, because I remember having Canadian friends over, and they were like, "Oh, could we go to an Irish bar?" And I was like, "We just call them
Yeah,
bars."
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not really the an Irish thing. So
for sure.
anyway,
So that all
that
said,
has nothing to
it's
do with cappuccinos.
yeah. So that all said, it's like it is interesting. I do think that, and we can wrap up in a few minutes. People have been we've had a few people watching this whole time.
They've suffered enough.
Yeah, but the point is that I do find it interesting in light of like larger conversations about culture and what culture appropriation means. Like personally, I always say that I don't like the framing of like cultural appreciation versus appropriation. I think of it as like there's a lot of appropriation happening. It's just that there's some that's problematic and a lot of it's
Yeah.
okay. There's like a right and a wrong way to do it. I do
Hmm.
think that the desire for some people to erase the cultural sort of legacy of Italian espresso drinks like cappuccino and such. I
Hmm.
find that a little bit alarming, actually, to be honest. Like, I
Hmm.
think that in a lot of ways, like, Ireland is, as far as I know, Ireland as a country has never colonized anyone, have they?
No, there was an Irish invasion of Canada from a from a base in the United States. A group of Irish people got
Really?
together and
I
tried to
don't know this
invade
story.
Canada. I think it was an invasion that lasted 3 days or something like that. But
Right.
aside from that, we have never colonized any
Yeah,
country.
Korea's never colonized anyone. I do feel I always find it interesting that there is something
Mm.
to cultures and the way that people think about stuff and the way that we internalize some of those feelings. I talk about this a lot, this like idea of like colonizer culture and how it's internalized in individuals. So in this situation, it's like, what does that even mean? Someone might wonder. It's like, well, to me, colonizer mentality is I take what I want. I derive value from anything that I want, and in return, I will determine what value you get in return. Full
Mm.
stop. Like that is like to me like the colonizer mentality, and that what's missing from that is some understanding, some like fundamental empathy about like an exchange and what's fair, and that if I piss you off, then that's not okay. Because I have to live with you. I have to like live as neighbors. We have to coexist, kind of thing, and
Mm.
and how that speaks to your community and how the community effects are going to be. Like when you remove those
Yeah.
things, you can be a little bit more of that extraction of value kind of mentality. So it makes me wonder, it's like in that situation where certain people feel so free to just be like, well, we're going to erase the name of the drink because I don't want you to think about it. Like I want you to think about it
Yeah.
this way, that I, as much as like Italians are not being held up in our global conversation about these things as a disenfranchised culture, that still like we shouldn't take these things lightly, even when is being done to quote unquote like white cultures. That it's
Hmm.
not something that we should be in the practice of doing. Period. That's just my
Yeah.
2 cents
I
on.
Well, I think that's fair. I think it definitely brings the conversation full circles and ties in a lot of the things we spoke about because, like, definitely, you can say this as objectively as you possibly can be, and I hope I'm not offending people, but a lot of Italian coffee is just not good quality.
Hmm.
It's poor grade. It's made with UHT milk out of machines that aren't being cleaned very well, and all these other things that we strive for in our shops and competitions. But as we see specialty coffee I suppose, gain traction in that country. I suppose it's the opposite of what you're talking about there. Maybe they can take from us now, okay? And because they really, better than you and I, they understand the essence of what an espresso is and the essence of what a cappuccino is better than what we are and the cultural resonance of what those things are. And maybe they can take from us and reapply those. And what if they had a traditional a traditional Italian espresso blend, but made it really great coffees that were, bought in ethical ways and had really great flavor and the same nuance, but just in, I suppose, a cleaner way.
Yeah.
And with with fresh, milk the way they do with their cheeses. Their
Right.
cheeses are incredible in that country. So maybe they could take from us and I suppose reinvigorate that culture that they already
And we've
have. That would
seen
be a
some of
really
that,
nice way to
right?
spin it.
We've seen some of that,
Yeah.
the evidence. Like, what's his name? Francesco Sinapo out there, and some other folks as well, kind of holding it down. Like,
Sinapo, yeah.
yeah, trying to do some sort of third wavy stuff in Italy. I mean, it feels there, like you were saying, like it's this sort of re-importation of things. Like they go do a walkabout and then they come back, a little bit different, and in a lot of situations, like a
Yeah.
little bit alongside that kind of more traditional Italian coffee profile. But
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, good.
Kind of like how we have St. Patrick's Day parades now in Ireland.
Do you? Do you really?
Yeah, yeah. They started in the 70s, no, in the 80s or something. But
Oh,
no,
that's funny.
yeah. So the same thing. I don't know how I managed to wangle those two things together.
Yeah, but that's funny. It was a good chat. I'm glad we got to talk
It was
about this. We
brilliant.
didn't talk about
Yeah,
everything regarding cappuccino, but I feel like we were able to get into a lot of stuff, and I appreciate that. I appreciate you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you for asking me. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Yeah, okay, we'll catch up soon.
Tell Trish I said hi.
I will.
Ciao.